The Kaltara Corridor was the safest place in the entire Dominion. Every officer in the Rathari fleet knew this. 40 capital ships patrolled it at all times. Weapons platforms floated between the stars like silent guards. No enemy had entered the corridor in over 400 years. It was the heart of the Empire's supply lines, and it was untouchable. Sub-Commander Torin stood on the bridge of his light cruiser, the Valeth, and stared at the same empty stretch of space he had been staring at for the last 6 hours. His crew moved slowly at their stations. Some of them were barely awake. There was nothing to do here. There was never anything to do here. Patrol duty in the Kaltara Corridor was not a mission. It was a punishment dressed up as an honor. "Anything on sensors?" Torin asked, more out of habit than hope. "Nothing, Sub-Commander," his sensor officer replied without looking up. "Same as the last 400 years. A few crew members chuckled quietly. Torin did not smile. He leaned back in his chair and watched the stars drift slowly across the viewport. The Rathari Dominion controlled over 9,000 star systems. They had crushed every species that had ever challenged them. Peace, in the Dominion, was not something they had earned through diplomacy. It was something they had forced upon the galaxy through absolute power. And absolute power, Torin thought, made people very, very lazy. Then his sensor screen flickered. It was small, a tiny ripple in the gravitational field, like a stone dropped into still water. It lasted less than a second, and then it was gone. Torin sat up straight. He looked at his sensor officer, who was frowning at his console. "Did you see that?" Torin asked. "A minor gravitational fluctuation," the officer said slowly. "Maybe a micro-anomaly in the local space-time fabric. It happens sometimes near dense shipping lanes." "Log it," Torin said. The officer looked at him with mild surprise, but did as he was told. Torin stared at the spot on his screen where the ripple had appeared. Something felt wrong. He could not explain it. It was like standing in an empty room and feeling certain that someone was watching. He was right. Far below the layer of reality that Torin's sensors could detect, a ship was moving. It was not a large ship by Dominion standards. It was angular and dark, built from heavy armor plates and sharp edges, with none of the elegant curves that Rathari shipbuilders favored. Painted on its hull, in white letters, was a name, HSS Grim Dawn, and on its bridge, a man named Han Do-hyun stood perfectly still, watching a holographic display that showed him everything the Rathari could not see. Phase Space is holding steady. Shin Unji, from her station at the back of the bridge. She was watching her instruments with the intense focus of a woman who had spent 12 years building something that everyone told her was impossible. The Phase Walk Drive, her creation, hummed softly beneath their feet. It bent the ship out of normal space-time and pushed it into a dimensional layer that existed just underneath reality. In phase space, they were invisible. No sensors in the known galaxy could detect them. They were ghosts. "Fuel status?" Do-hyun asked. His voice was calm and flat, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury he could not afford. Ensign Kwan Nari checked her console. She was the youngest person on the bridge, 23 years old, fresh from the academy, and her hands had not stopped shaking since they had entered phase space 6 hours ago. "We have burned through 38% of our phase walk fuel, Captain," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have enough for approximately 3 more full transitions." Do-hyun nodded slowly. 3 more jumps. That was all they had. He looked at the holographic display again. It showed the Kaltara corridor in perfect detail. Every patrol ship, every weapons platform, every supply convoy. The Rathari thought they were alone out here. They had no idea that a human warship was drifting through their most secure territory like a knife sliding between ribs. "Captain," said Lieutenant Yoon Ji-soo from the tactical station. She was leaning forward in her chair, with a grin on her face that Do-hyun had learned to be both grateful for and worried about. I have firing solutions on 6 targets. Just say the word. Not yet, Do-hyun said. You always say that. And I am always right. Commander Baek Sung-ho, the first officer, stood beside Do-hyun with his arms folded. He was a tall man with a quiet face, the kind of person who spoke only when he had something worth saying. He looked at Do-hyun now and said simply, "It is time, Captain." Do-hyun took a slow breath. He thought about Earth. He thought about what the Dominion had planned for his world. 30 years ago, a Rothari survey ship had found humanity. It had scanned their planet, studied their civilization, and filed a report that classified Earth as a primitive, pre-FTL world suitable for future resource extraction and population resettlement. In simple terms, they had looked at 8 billion human beings and seen nothing but future slaves. Humanity had intercepted that report, and they had spent the last 3 decades preparing in silence, building something the galaxy had never seen before. Not a bigger weapon, not a faster engine, something stranger, something that broke the rules entirely. And now it was time to let the Dominion know. "Dr. Shin," Do-hyun said, "bring us out of phase space. Drop us right in the center of the corridor, between the 2 largest ships you can find." Yoonji looked up from her console. For a moment her scientific calm cracked, and he could see the fear underneath. Then she nodded and began the sequence. The phase walk drive changed its tone. The hum became a whine, then a roar. The lights on the bridge flickered. Nari gripped her console with white knuckles. Jisoo's grin widened. And then the HSS Grim Dawn tore through the fabric of space and appeared in the middle of the Kaltara corridor. On Torin's bridge, every alarm went off at once. Red light flooded the room. His sensor officer screamed something incoherent. Torin grabbed his console and stared at the screen. A ship, an unknown ship, had just materialized between 2 Dominion battlecruisers. There was no warp trail, no hyperspace signature, no approach vector. It had simply appeared from absolutely nothing, as if reality itself had opened the door and let it through. Across the corridor, every Rothari ship was reacting. Weapons were charging. Shields were going up. Communications channels exploded with overlapping voices shouting for orders, identification, explanations. No one had any answers. Then a signal cut through every frequency in the corridor. It was broadcast in perfect Rothari, translated flawlessly, and it came from the impossible ship that hung silently between 2 of the most powerful warships in the Dominion. The message was simple. "We know you are coming for our world. We wanted you to know. We can reach yours first." Torin read the words on his screen and felt something cold settle into his chest. Before anyone in the corridor could respond, before a single weapon could fire, the ship flickered once, like a candle in the wind, and vanished. It did not fly away. It did not jump to hyperspace. It simply stopped existing, as if it had never been there at all. The corridor fell into chaos. Officers shouted. Ships broke formation. Sensor teams ran scans that found nothing. Torin sat in his chair and stared at the empty space where the ship had been. His hands were trembling. In 400 years, nothing had entered the Kaltara corridor uninvited. Tonight, something had appeared from nowhere, spoken directly to the heart of the Empire, and disappeared like a ghost. And the Rothari Dominion, for the first time in living memory, had no idea what to do about it. The news reached Rothara Prime before the official reports did. Rumors spread through military channels like fire through dry grass. A ghost ship in the Kaltara corridor, an unknown species, a message that sounded like a threat. By the time Fleet Marshal Drenak sat down to read the actual sensor data, half the officer corps was already talking about it. Drenak was old, even by Rothari standards. He had commanded fleets for over 2 centuries. He had crushed rebellions, burned colonies, and broken the backs of 3 separate species who had dared to challenge the Dominion. He had seen everything the galaxy had to offer, or so he thought. But as he read Torin's report for the third time, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt afraid. The data was clear and impossible at the same time. A vessel had appeared inside the most heavily defended corridor in the Dominion, with zero warning. No known form of faster-than-light travel could do this. Warp drives left energy signatures. Hyperspace jumps created detectable tunnel openings. Gate travel required fixed infrastructure. This ship had used none of these. It had simply stepped into existence, delivered its message, and stepped out again. The sensors had recorded the event, but could not explain it. It was as if the ship had walked through a door that the Rithari did not know existed. Drenak closed the report and sat in silence for a long time. Then he requested an audience with the Grand Sovereign. The throne room of Rithara Prime was built to make visitors feel small. It was a vast hall of dark stone and golden light, with pillars that rose so high they disappeared into shadow. Grand Sovereign Velthos sat at the far end, on a throne carved from the core metal of a dead star. He was enormous, even for a Rothari, and his presence filled the room like a weight pressing down on everyone in it. Drenak walked the long approach to the throne and presented his findings. He spoke carefully and clearly. He showed the sensor data. He played the message. He explained that the technology used by the unknown vessel did not match anything in the Dominion's records. He recommended an immediate halt to all offensive operations until the threat could be assessed. Velthos listened, with the patience of someone who had ruled 9,000 star systems for longer than most species had existed. When Drenak finished, the Grand Sovereign looked down at him and said, "One ship." "Yes, Grand Sovereign. One ship from a species that did not even have basic faster-than-light travel 30 cycles ago." "That is correct, Grand Sovereign. Which makes this even more—" "It makes it nothing." Velthos waved a massive hand dismissively. "A desperate act from a desperate species that knows what is coming for them. They have found some clever way to mask their approach. Nothing more. We will not change our plans because one small ship appeared in a corridor and ran away." Advisor Ilkari, who stood at the Sovereign's side like a thin shadow, nodded quickly. "I agree, Grand Sovereign. This is clearly a provocation designed to delay our expansion schedule. If we pause now, we reward their boldness." Drenak kept his face still, but inside, frustration burned. "Grand Sovereign, with respect, no known cloaking technology can produce what our sensors recorded. This is not a hidden approach. The ship was simply not there, and then it was. Whatever they have built, it represents a gap in our defensive capabilities that we do not understand." Velthos leaned forward. His eyes were cold. "Then perhaps, Fleet Marshal, you should spend less time worrying and more time closing that gap. The annexation fleet for the human homeworld will launch on schedule. In fact, I am moving the timeline forward. 200 warships. If these humans wish to play with ghosts, we will answer with iron." Drenak bowed and left the throne room. He said nothing more. He had served the Dominion long enough to know when a conversation was over. But as he walked through the corridors of the palace, his mind was already working. 200 ships might not be enough. He did not know why he felt this way. He only knew that a species capable of building something this strange was a species that should not be underestimated. On the other side of the Dominion, aboard his cruiser, Sub-Commander Torin could not sleep. He sat alone in his quarters, playing the sensor recording over and over on his personal screen. The moment of appearance, the message, the disappearance. He had watched it perhaps 100 times now. He had requested access to the Dominion's files on humans. What he found was almost nothing. A brief survey report from 30 years ago, some basic biological data, images of their cities, their vehicles, their primitive communication networks. The report concluded that humans were unremarkable, a young species on a small world, decades or centuries away from being a real civilization. But one detail in the report stopped Torin cold. It was buried in a section about human weapons technology. The survey team had noted, almost casually, that humans had developed nuclear weapons, devices capable of destroying entire cities, before they had achieved space travel. They had built the ability to wipe themselves out, before they had even learned to leave their own planet. Torin stared at this sentence for a long time. Every other species in the Dominion's records had followed the same path. They developed space travel, then expanded, then eventually developed weapons of mass destruction as their empires grew. The idea of building such weapons while still trapped on a single world was something no Rothari strategist would even consider. It was insane. It was suicidal. And it told Torin something very important about the kind of species they were dealing with. These were not careful people. These were not patient people. These were people who would rather burn than bend. He requested a transfer to the annexation fleet. His commanding officer was surprised, but approved it. Torin packed his things and tried to ignore the feeling that he was walking towards something terrible. Far away, in the darkness between stars, the HSS Grim Dawn drifted silently through phase space. The celebration on the bridge had been short. Captain Han Do-hyun had allowed his crew 10 minutes of relief before bringing them back to reality. The mission was a success, he told Commander Baek Sung-ho quietly, standing at the viewport while the strange dim light of phase space shifted around them. They know we exist. They know we can reach them. That was the goal. Sung-ho nodded slowly. And now? Now they will come for Earth faster than planned. We have made them angry. And angry empires do not wait. Do-hyun turned to face his first officer. The Defense Council on Earth needs time. The new ships are not ready. We bought them attention, but attention is not enough. We need to buy them months. With one ship, Sung-ho said. It was not a question. With one ship, Do-hyun confirmed. He looked back at the viewport. Nari, what is our fuel status? Ensign Kwan Nari's voice came from across the bridge, tired but steady. 3 phase walk transitions remaining, Captain. Maybe 3.5, if Dr. Shin can optimize the drive cycle. 3 jumps, 3 chances to appear, strike, and vanish. Against a fleet of 200 warships that would soon be heading toward everything Do-hyun had ever loved. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his face was set like stone. Plot a course along the fleet's most likely approach route, he said. We are going hunting. On Earth, deep underground, in a bunker built beneath a mountain range, the United Defense Council received the Grim Dawn's transmission. The mission was confirmed. The Dominion had been shaken. Phase walk technology worked. But the room was not filled with celebration. A display on the wall showed the construction status of 12 new phase walk warships. The nearest one was 4 months from completion, and intelligence suggested the Dominion fleet would reach Earth in less than 3. The council chairman looked at the display and said what everyone in the room was thinking. Everything depends on that one ship now. Somewhere in the dark between galaxies, the Grim Dawn moved like a shadow through a world no one else could see, carrying the hopes of 8 billion people on a hull of steel and silence. The Dominion annexation fleet moved through deep space like a river of metal and fire. 200 warships in perfect formation, each one large enough to cast a shadow over a small city. Battlecruisers, destroyers, carriers, and support vessels stretched across thousands of kilometers in a wall of military power that had broken entire civilizations before. At its center flew the flagship, the Sovereign's Wrath, a dreadnought so massive that it carried its own gravity well. This was the fist of the Rothari Dominion, and it was aimed directly at a small blue planet that most of the galaxy had never heard of. From phase space, Captain Han Do-hyun watched them come. The holographic display on the Grimdawn's bridge showed every ship in the fleet, mapped by the passive sensors that Dr. Shin Unji had designed to peer through the barrier between phase space and normal reality. 200 points of light, moving in a slow, unstoppable wave. Do-hyun studied them the way a hunter studies a herd, not looking for the strongest, but for the weakest, the stragglers, the gaps. "So what is the plan, Captain?" Lieutenant Yoon Jisoo asked from the tactical station. Her fingers were already resting on the weapons console. Do-hyun looked at the fleet on the display. Then he looked at his own ship. One vessel, low on fuel, with a crew of 40. He almost smiled. "We make them afraid of the dark," he said. The first attack came 12 hours later. A Rothari supply ship, the Kethera, was traveling at the rear of the formation. It carried fuel cells, ammunition, and replacement parts for the fleet's energy weapons. It was lightly armed and lightly shielded, protected by its position deep within the formation. No enemy could reach it without fighting through dozens of warships first. The Grim Dawn appeared 30 meters off its port side. There was no warning, no sensor contact, no energy buildup. One moment, the space beside the Kethera was empty. The next moment, a human warship was there, so close that the crew of the Kethera could see the scorch marks on its hull through their viewports. Lieutenant Yoon Jisoo fired everything. 4 kinetic rounds punched through the supply ship's thin hull before its shields could activate. A plasma torpedo hit its engine block and turned it into a ball of white fire. The Kethera broke apart in 7 seconds. By the time the nearest Dominion warship turned its weapons toward the attacker, the Grim Dawn had already slipped back into phase space and vanished. The entire attack lasted 53 seconds. Panic spread through the fleet like poison. Communications channels overflowed with voices demanding answers. How had an enemy ship appeared inside the formation? Where had it gone? Was it still here? Captains began charging weapons and spinning their ships in every direction, searching for a target that no longer existed. 2 destroyers nearly collided when one mistook the other's engine flare for a hostile contact. Do-hyun waited 8 hours. Then he struck again. This time, it was an escort frigate on the fleet's left flank. The Grim Dawn dropped out of phase space behind it, fired a concentrated burst into its shield generators, and disappeared before the frigate's crew could even identify what had hit them. The frigate survived, but its shields were destroyed, and its communications array was gone. It drifted blind and deaf until another ship could reach it. The third attack came 6 hours after that. Then another, 4 hours later. Then another. Do-hyun never hit the same part of the formation twice. He never attacked when the fleet expected it. He chose targets that were isolated, distracted, or complacent, and he hit them with brutal precision before fading back into nothing. The fleet began to break. Not physically. The ships were still intact, still powerful, still vastly superior to anything humanity could put in their path. But something deeper was cracking. Confidence, certainty, the unshakable belief that the Rothari Dominion was untouchable. Crew members stopped sleeping. Gunners kept their fingers on triggers at all times, jumping at sensor ghosts and engine noise. Some captains began breaking formation, pulling their ships away from the group to give themselves more room to maneuver. Others refused to advance at all, demanding reinforcements before they would move another light year. Shin Unji made things worse. She had spent 2 days modifying the Grim Dawn sensor array to broadcast false phase walk signatures, phantom echoes that mimicked the gravitational ripple of a ship entering or leaving phase space. She planted them across the fleet's sensor grid like seeds. Suddenly, the Dominion was seeing ghost ships everywhere. Weapons fired at empty space. Ships changed course to chase signals that did not exist. A battlecruiser spent 3 hours hunting a phantom contact that turned out to be a reflection of its own engine signature bouncing off Unji's planted echo. Do-hyun watched the chaos from phase space and felt no joy. This was not a victory. This was survival, measured in hours and counted in the lives of Rathari sailors who had no idea what they were truly fighting against. But every hour the fleet spent chasing ghosts was an hour closer to Earth's new ships being finished. That was all that mattered. On Rothara Prime, Grand Sovereign Velthos received the reports with growing fury. His fleet, the most powerful military force in the galaxy, was being humiliated by a single ship. He summoned Fleet Marshal Drenak and gave him a simple order: go to the fleet, take command, and end this. Drenak arrived aboard a fast transport 3 days later and immediately took control. He was calm where others were panicking. He was precise where others were flailing. Within hours, he had restored formation discipline, silenced the most fearful captains, and implemented new sensor protocols to filter out the false phase walk echoes. The fleet steadied. The advance resumed. But Drenak was not calm inside. He sat alone in his command quarters aboard the Sovereign's Wrath and studied every attack the human ship had made. He plotted them on a timeline. He mapped the locations. He analyzed the targeting choices, and slowly a pattern emerged that chilled him. The humans were not trying to destroy the fleet. The attacks were too small, too targeted, too careful. A supply ship here, a sensor array there, an escort frigate's shields. They were not aiming for kills, they were aiming for delay. Every attack forced the fleet to stop, regroup, and scan for threats before moving again. Every phantom echo added hours to the journey. The human ship was bleeding time out of the Dominion fleet, drop by drop. They are stalling, Drenak said to the empty room. He looked at the star map on his wall, at the tiny dot that represented Earth. What are they building back on that little world that they need so desperately to protect? He did not know the answer, but he knew it frightened him. Aboard the Grim Dawn, the cost of the campaign was becoming impossible to ignore. The phase walk drive was running dangerously hot. Shin Unji had not slept in 40 hours, nursing the engine through each transition with the desperate care of a surgeon keeping a dying patient alive. Ensign Quan Nari reported that they had fuel for one more full phase walk. Maybe 1.5, if they shortened the transition window and accepted the risk of a partial emergence. The crew was exhausted. They had been living on emergency rations and sleeping in shifts for over a week. During the last attack, a Rothari energy lance had clipped the Grim Dawn's lower hull, burning through 2 compartments and killing 3 crew members. They were the first human casualties of the war, and Do-hyun had stood over their covered bodies in the cargo bay and made himself remember each of their names. Commander Baek Sung-ho found him there afterward. "We cannot keep this up," Sung-ho said quietly. "I know," Do-hyun replied. "That is all we have." "I know." "Then we need to make it count." Do-hyun looked up. His eyes were red with fatigue. But behind the tiredness, something burned. A hard, bright determination that Sung-ho had seen before, in the worst moments of the Unification Wars, when Do-hyun had done impossible things simply because the alternative was unacceptable. "Drenak has taken command," Do-hyun said. "He is smart. He has figured out our pattern. He will be expecting us to hit the edges again, the soft targets." He paused. "So we hit the center instead. We go for the flagship." Sung-ho was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. On the bridge of the Sovereign's Wrath, Drenak looked at the formation he had built, a ring of warships with overlapping fire zones, all centered on his own flagship. The most tempting target in the fleet, surrounded by the most deadly trap he could devise. He was daring the humans to come to him. Somewhere in the darkness, Han Do-hyun looked at the same formation on his display. He saw the trap clearly. Every gun, every angle, every kill zone. It was a perfect cage, designed to catch a ghost. He turned to his crew. "We go in," he said. The bridge, of the HSS Grim Dawn was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a resting crew, but the heavy silence of people who understood exactly what was about to happen. The overhead lights had been dimmed to save power, and the soft blue glow of the holographic display was the brightest thing in the room. It showed the Dominion fleet in perfect detail. 200 ships arranged in a tight defensive sphere, with the flagship Sovereign's Wrath at its heart, like a spider in the center of a web. Every ship in that sphere had its weapons aimed inward, ready to destroy anything that appeared near the flagship. Captain Han Do-hyun stood in front of the display and looked at his crew. They looked back at him with tired eyes and steady hands. Lieutenant Yoon Ji-soo sat at the tactical console, her jaw set, her fingers already moving across the targeting controls. Commander Baek Sung-ho stood at his usual place beside the captain's chair, arms folded, face unreadable. Ensign Kwon Nari sat at navigation, her earlier nervousness replaced by something harder and more certain. Dr. Shin Eun-ji was at the engineering station, her hand resting on the phase walk drive controls, like a musician about to play her final note. "I will not lie to you," Do-hyun said. His voice was low but clear, and every person on the bridge heard him. "We have fuel for one jump. The drive is overheating. We are going into the center of a trap that was built specifically to kill us. The chances of us coming back from this are very small." He paused. No one moved. No one looked away. "But if we can cripple that flagship, the fleet loses its brain. Drenak is the only commander smart enough to hold this fleet together. Without him, they fall apart. They delay. They argue. And every day they waste is a day closer to our new ships being ready." He took a breath. "We were never meant to win this war alone. We were meant to buy time. And this is where we spend what is left." The silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then Commander Baek Sung-ho uncrossed his arms and said in the same calm tone he used to order coffee, "Then let us make sure they remember us." A ripple went through the bridge. Not fear, something else. Something that straightened spines and steadied hands. Jisoo cracked her knuckles. Nari adjusted her console. Enji began the phase walk startup sequence. The drive's hum filled the ship like a heartbeat getting faster. "Nari," Do-hyun said, "I need you to do something impossible." Nari looked up. "Standard phase walk emergence puts us at a safe distance from any large object, at least 500 meters. I need you to drop us closer, much closer. I want us to appear directly above the flagship, hull to hull, close enough that the surrounding ships cannot fire at us without hitting their own commander." The mathematics of what he was asking flashed through her mind. A phase walk emergence at that distance was not in any manual. The margin of error was measured in meters. If she was off by even a small amount, they would materialize inside the flagship's hull, and both ships would cease to exist in a flash of merged matter and released energy. "I can do it," she said. Do-hyun looked at her. "Are you sure?" Nari's hands moved across her console. Numbers and vectors flowed beneath her fingers. "I said I can do it, Captain." Do-hyun nodded. "Then take us in." The phase walk drive screamed. The lights on the bridge went out completely, replaced by the strange shifting glow of phase space bleeding through the hull. The ship shook violently. Eun-ji's hands danced across her controls, fighting to keep the overheating drive stable for just a few more seconds. Alarms sounded and were silenced. Metal groaned. Something deep in the ship cracked with a sound like breaking bone. And then the grim dawn tore back into reality. It appeared 22 meters above the Sovereign's Wrath. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Rathari. Every ship in the defensive sphere had been aiming at the spaces around the flagship, expecting an attacker to emerge at a distance. Instead, the human ship was sitting almost on top of the flagship itself. so close that its shadow fell across the dreadnought's bridge viewports. The surrounding warships could not fire. Their weapons were locked, their targeting systems screaming warnings about friendly fire. For a few precious seconds, the entire trap was useless. Jisoo did not waste a single one of those seconds. "Firing everything," she said, and her voice was perfectly calm, almost cheerful. The grim dawn unleashed the full force of its arsenal at point-blank range. Kinetic rounds hammered into the flagship's dorsal shields, each impact sending shockwaves through the massive ship's frame. Plasma torpedoes struck the engine section in rapid succession, turning armor plates into glowing liquid metal. And then, Jisoo activated the weapon that Dr. Shin Eun-ji had spent 5 years developing in secret, the Shatter Lance. It was a focused beam of compressed gravitational energy. It did not burn through shields the way energy weapons did. It did not punch through armor the way kinetic rounds did. It simply told a section of matter that it weighed 10,000 times more than it actually did, and the matter tore itself apart under its own impossible weight. The beam hit the Sovereign's Wrath amidships, and a section of the flagship's hull simply crumpled inward like a crushed tin can. The ship's internal structure buckled. Decks collapsed into each other. The main engine core breached, and a plume of white-hot plasma erupted from the flagship's belly. On the bridge of the Sovereign's Wrath, Fleet Marshal Drenok was thrown from his command chair as the deck beneath him split open. Fire filled the air. Support beams fell like trees in a storm. Officers screamed as consoles exploded around them. Through the smoke and the noise, Drenok pulled himself to his feet and looked up through a crack in the viewport. He could see the human ship above him. It was close enough to touch, or so it seemed. Its hull was scorched and dented. Sparks flew from a dozen breaches. One of its engine pods was dark and trailing smoke. It was clearly damaged, clearly dying, and it was still firing. Every weapon on its underside was pouring fire into the flagship, without pause, without mercy, without any sign of stopping. Drenok had fought dozens of species across hundreds of battles. He had seen bravery and cowardice, brilliance and stupidity in every possible combination. But he had never seen anything like this. This was not strategy. This was not even courage. This was something deeper, something that lived in the bones of this species. A refusal to stop, a willingness to burn themselves down if it meant taking their enemy with them. "What have we awakened?" he whispered to himself as the smoke swirled around him. His officers pulled him toward the escape pods. The flagship was dying. Nothing could save it now. As he stumbled through the collapsing corridors, he gave one last order over his communicator. "All ships, fire on the human vessel. Destroy it." But the order came too late, and the chaos was too great. Most ships still could not get a clear shot. Those that could were hesitating, terrified of hitting the flagship's escape pods that were now launching in every direction. On one of the surrounding cruisers, Sub-Commander Torin received the order and raised his weapons. His targeting computer locked on to the grim dawn. A clean shot. His finger hovered over the firing control. He hesitated. Through his viewport he could see the human ship. It was breaking apart. Fires burned along its hull. Its weapons were falling silent, one by one as power systems failed. It was no longer a warship. It was a wreck that refused to die. And somewhere inside that wreck, a crew of 40 humans was still fighting, still trying to do as much damage as possible before the end came. Torin thought about the file he had read. A species that built weapons to destroy itself before it could even leave its own world. A species that would fly one ship into the heart of an empire because the alternative was to let their home die without a fight. He adjusted his aim. Instead of targeting the Grim Dawn's reactor core, a killing shot, he targeted its engines. The blast struck the human ship's remaining engine pod and shattered it. The Grim Dawn went dark. Its weapons fell silent. It drifted, powerless, away from the burning wreck of the flagship. Torin told himself it was a tactical decision. A disabled ship could be studied. Its technology could be captured. He told himself this was the smart choice. He knew it was something else. On the bridge of the grim dawn, the lights were gone. Emergency power cast a faint red glow over the wreckage. Sparks fell from broken cables. The air smelled of smoke and burned metal. Captain Han Do-hyun lay against the base of his command chair, bleeding from a wound on his forehead. Half his console screens were shattered. Around him, his crew lay at their stations, injured, exhausted, but alive. "Nari," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "did we buy enough time?" Ensign Kwan Nari was slumped over her navigation console. She lifted her head slowly and looked at her instruments. Most of them were dead, but one screen still flickered with data, a long-range passive scan of the Dominion fleet. The fleet had stopped. The flagship was destroyed. Drenak was being evacuated. The command structure was shattered. Ships were drifting without orders, some retreating, others holding position in confusion. The advance on Earth had ground to a complete halt. Nari looked at the data and felt tears sting her eyes. "I think so, Captain," she whispered. "I think so." Do-hyun closed his eyes and let his head rest against the cold metal of his chair. Outside, the Dominion fleet hung in the void like a scattered flock of birds that had lost their leader. And the grim dawn, dark and silent and broken, drifted among them like a fallen star. 3 weeks passed, and the galaxy held its breath. The Dominion annexation fleet did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply sat in the Verith expanse like a wounded animal, bleeding command authority and morale, while it waited for orders that kept changing. 7 different officers tried to take command after Drenak was evacuated. 3 of them were removed by their own crews within days. 2 more argued with each other so fiercely over strategy that their ships nearly opened fire on one another. The fleet that was supposed to crush a planet could not even agree on which direction to face. Fleet Marshal Drenak recovered slowly aboard a medical ship behind the fleet's lines. The injuries from the flagship's destruction were severe. Burns across his left side, a shattered leg, damaged lungs from smoke. But it was not his body that concerned the doctors. The look of a man who had spent 2 centuries believing he understood war, only to discover that he had never truly been tested until now. When he was strong enough to sit upright, he dictated a classified report. It was addressed directly to Grand Sovereign Velthos, marked with the highest level of secrecy the Dominion possessed. He had spent every waking hour since the battle, replaying the events in his mind, analyzing the human tactics, studying the wreckage of his own flagship. And he had reached a conclusion that he knew the Grand Sovereign would not want to hear. The report was blunt. The humans possessed a technology that the Dominion could not detect, could not counter, and did not understand. A single ship, crewed by fewer than 40 individuals, had entered the most secure corridor in the Dominion undetected, waged a guerrilla campaign that paralyzed a fleet of 200 warships for over a week, and then destroyed the fleet's flagship in a direct assault that should have been suicidal, but instead succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The humans had done this with 1 ship. 1. "I must state clearly what this means," Drenak wrote. "If the humans have had time to build more of these vessels, and I believe they have, then the military equation has changed permanently. We cannot annex their world. We cannot blockade them. We cannot predict where they will strike or defend against attacks we cannot see coming. For the first time in the history of the Dominion, we face an enemy that exists outside the rules of warfare as we understand them." He paused for a long time before writing the final line. "I recommend diplomatic contact." The report reached Rathara Prime and landed on the Grand Sovereign's desk like a bomb. Velthos read it alone in his private chambers. He read it once, then again, then a 3rd time. Advisor Ilkari was summoned and read it as well. For once, The advisor had nothing clever to say. He simply stood in silence, his thin hands clasped behind his back, and waited for the sovereign to speak. Velthos was many things: proud, ruthless, ancient. But he was not stupid. He had ruled 9,000 star systems by knowing when to use force and when to recognize that force would cost more than it gained. The humans were not a conquered species resisting occupation. They were something new, something that could appear anywhere, at any time, and strike without warning. The cost of conquering them would not be measured in ships lost during the invasion. It would be measured in the centuries of paranoia that would follow, never knowing when or where a human ghost ship might appear next, never sleeping soundly again. For the first time in the Dominion's recorded history, the Grand Sovereign sent a diplomatic envoy to a species he had previously marked for annexation. The galaxy watched in stunned silence. On Earth, the news of the Grim Dawn's sacrifice had arrived weeks before the diplomatic offer. The crew's final transmission, a burst of compressed data sent seconds before the ship lost power, had been received by a deep space listening post on the edge of the solar system. It contained everything: sensor logs, tactical recordings, fuel consumption data, and a brief personal message from Captain Han Do-hyun. The message said only, "Drive works, fleet is stopped, finish the ships." The United Defense Council had worked without rest since receiving it. In underground shipyards carved into asteroids and hidden beneath oceans, 12 new Phase Walk warships were being completed at a speed that should have been impossible. Engineers worked double shifts. Scientists slept beside their instruments. Resources were pulled from every nation on Earth without argument or complaint. For the first time in human history, there were no political disputes about funding, no debates about priorities. 8 billion people had learned that their world was one fleet away from enslavement, and one crew of 40 had given everything to stop it. The least the rest of humanity could do was finish what they started. The 12th ship powered up its phase walk drive 3 days before the Dominion's diplomatic envoy arrived. The fleet was named the Dawn Fleet, after the ship and the crew that had made it possible. Humanity now had a deterrent. Not enough to destroy the Dominion, probably not enough to survive a full-scale war, but enough to make that war so painful, so unpredictable, and so costly that no rational empire would choose to fight it. 12 ships that could appear anywhere, strike anything, and vanish into a dimension the Dominion could not even access. 12 ghosts, where before there had been one. Meanwhile, in the Verath expanse, a Rathari patrol cruiser found the wreck of the Grim Dawn, drifting in the void. Sub-Commander Torin led the boarding party himself. He brought medical teams and translators, not soldiers. What he found inside the ship shook him in ways he would never fully be able to explain. The human crew was alive. Barely. 37 survivors out of 40, living on emergency rations and recycled air in the handful of compartments that still held atmosphere. They were thin, pale, and injured. Several had wrapped their own wounds with strips of torn uniform fabric. The ship's medical officer had been treating broken bones with improvised splints made from pieces of the shattered bridge console. Captain Han Do-hyun was conscious, sitting upright against a wall, with a makeshift bandage around his head. When Torin entered the compartment, Do-hyun looked up at him with calm, steady eyes and said nothing. He did not beg, he did not threaten, he simply waited, as if he had already accepted every possible outcome and found peace with all of them. Torin stood before him for a long moment. Dominion protocol was clear. Enemy combatants were to be processed as prisoners of war, interrogated, and held indefinitely. Their technology was to be seized and analyzed. Their captain would be brought before a military tribunal. Torin looked at the crew around him. Lieutenant Yoon Ji-soo, her arm broken and bound against her chest, still managed to glare at him with fierce, unbroken defiance. Commander Baek Sung-ho sat beside his captain, calm and watchful. Ensign Kwan Nari was asleep in the corner, exhaustion finally winning over fear. Dr. Shin Yun-ji sat next to the Phase Walk drive's access panel, and Torin noticed that she had smashed the drive's core memory before the boarding party arrived. Even now, even defeated, they were protecting their secrets. Torin made a decision that could end his career. He logged the human crew as recovered casualties of a navigational incident, and ordered his medical teams to treat their injuries immediately. He made no mention of interrogation. He made no move to seize the ship's technology. He simply ensured that the people who had fought the most remarkable battle he had ever witnessed were given food, water, and medical care. When his second officer questioned the decision, Torin said only, "They have earned better than a cell." The diplomatic envoy from the Dominion reached Earth's solar system on a cold, clear morning. The United Defense Council debated how to respond. Some voices called for rejection. Others demanded reparations, apologies, or unconditional surrender. The anger in the room was immense. These were the people who had planned to enslave humanity, and now they wanted to talk. In the end, the Council agreed to meet, but on humanity's terms. The meeting would take place on Earth, the Dominion would come to them, and the Dawn Fleet would be visible in orbit overhead, a silent reminder of what humanity could now do. Captain Han Do-hyun was released as part of the preliminary diplomatic arrangements. He returned to Earth with his surviving crew on a Rothari transport, a journey that was strange and silent, and filled with long looks between species that were still learning to see each other as something other than enemies. On the day the Rothari diplomatic shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, Do-hyun stood in a garden outside the military hospital where he had been recovering. The sky was blue and wide, and the air smelled like grass and rain, and for a moment he simply stood and breathed, and remembered what it felt like to be home. Commander Baek Sung-ho found him there, and stood beside him, watching the sky. "They are actually coming," Sung-ho said quietly, as the shuttle appeared through the clouds, descending slowly toward the landing zone. Do-hyun nodded. "One ship," he murmured. "We changed the course of an empire with one ship." Then, with the faintest trace of a smile, he added, "Imagine what we will do with 12. Lieutenant Yoon Jisoo walked up behind them, her arms still in a sling, and her stride still carrying that fearless energy that no amount of injury seemed capable of slowing down. She looked up at the shuttle dropping through the sky, and then at the two men beside her. "Honestly," she said, "I hope we never have to find out." The three of them stood together in the garden as the shuttle landed and the doors opened, and the first Rothari diplomat stepped onto human soil. Above them, invisible against the blue sky but very much present, 12 warships held silent orbit around the Earth. 12 ghosts, watching, waiting, ready. The war was over before it truly began. Not because humanity was stronger, not because the Dominion was weak, but because one crew, on one ship, had flown into the dark and refused to be afraid. And in doing so, they had taught an empire of 9,000 stars a lesson it would never forget. Some species conquer through power, some survive through patience. Humans, the galaxy was learning, did something else entirely. They walked into impossible situations with open eyes, made their peace with the consequences, and then fought so fiercely that the universe itself had to make room for them. The Grim Dawn never flew again. Its broken hull was brought back to Earth and placed in a memorial at the center of the new United Fleet Academy, where every cadet would pass it on their first day and their last. A plaque on its hull carried a single line, chosen by Captain Han Do-hyun himself. It read, "We were 40, we were enough."